Hello, everybody. Welcome. Also, the viewers at home, online, a warm welcome to you guys. When watching this video, actually a quote of the Pope came to mind for me. We're not living in an era of change, but we're living through the change of an era. This is also a big theme in the podcast series we make for NRC Future Affairs. My name is Wouter van Noort. I'm a journalist for NRC.
And I am Jessica van der Schalk, and I work for a think tank here in Amsterdam full of philosophers.
Called Freedom Lab.
Yeah, called Freedom Lab.
And what we do in this podcast is we speak to pioneers, thinkers, philosophers, people from quantum mechanics, all kinds of fields, about the big question, what's popping up in the near future? What should we prepare for, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And what is it we do in that podcast?
Well, the main question now, also related to what we're going to discuss today, is, are we, as humanity, do we have free will? And if we do, can we act upon it? Because many problems we face now require for us to change and to take action. And at the same time, there's a new popular story that we are part of a bigger whole. We are all connected, entangled. We are part of nature, maybe even part of the universe. But if that is so, what does that tell us about free will? Are we even capable?
Can we actually change the future that's coming ahead, right?
Can we make a change?
And there's vibes of apocalyptic thinking and vibes of optimism always in the talks we have. And I think today is a perfect example of that. We have Toby Ord, with which I'm really happy and proud that he took the time to talk to us today. And quite a big topic, the future of existence, existential risk. Yeah. Not a cheerful topic to start with.
No, it's really frightening.
But also in history there are sort of seeds of optimism and seeds of apocalypse. And maybe to start off with a bit of the optimism, we have a great opening act today, award-winning poet, columnist for a little newspaper called NRC, Ellen Deckwitz. So give her a big hand for an opening column.
Thank you, Wouter. You're too kind. Hello, everybody. I'm so happy you're here, not having corona. So let's start. I made a speech just to start a little bit light-hearted before we all get really depressed by the next hour. My dear fellow Brainwashians, so I have the honor of being the support act of a program that's going to be as exciting as it will be alarming. Mr. Ord is going to inform us about the survival of humankind, and in order to do so, will tell us how deep we are in trouble right now if we don't change our ways. And it's going to be an interesting but not a carefree hour. And while I was reading Mr. Ord's latest book, The Precipice, I felt hopeful but also a little bit distressed, since it conveys some very disturbing facts. For example, that the Biological Weapons Convention, that is a global agreement for protecting humanity, only has 4 employees and a smaller budget than the average McDonald's restaurant. And then there are also his anecdotes about infectious diseases like polio, SARS, and the bubonic plague that accidentally escaped from laboratories. And though The Precipice is not a really depressing book, it's filled with possibilities and solutions, it doesn't shy away from the fact that right now, all of us are a little bit in trouble. And to prevent us all from getting too gloomy, like I said before, I'm going to share some thoughts with you that I had when reading his book that really cheered me up a little bit, and I hope you as well. Thought number 1. We are living in what the Chinese may call it very interesting times. Humankind has not only reached the possibility to exterminate itself in a number of ways, there are also a lot of people in power right now who turn out to be very dangerous for the safety, let alone the life expectancy of the people they are supposed to govern. I mean, from Bolsonaro in Brazil to Boris Johnson in England, and here in Holland, good old Mark Rutte and Hugo de Jonge. And I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I dream away and think of all the historical heroes I would love to have in charge right now instead of Viktor Orban or Scott Morrison. I dream of leaders who care more about people than about power. So what if we could raise some of the most enlightened humans that ever walked the earth from the dead and let them help us? So we could put Marcus Aurelius in charge of the UN and Charlemagne of the European Union. And what if Catherine the Great or Abraham Lincoln were leading Facebook or Amazon? I mean, if only. But, and now comes the optimistic twist, the same goes the other way around. I mean, we live in a time where some disaster artists have considerable influence on the future of humankind, but I'd rather have them than, let's say, Caligula in charge. And it's sometimes really helpful, for sanity's sake, to remember which idiots have already, thank God, passed away. I mean, we owe our actual existence to the fact that some mentally disabled rulers like Nero, Bloody Mary, Vlad Tepes, George III, and Ivan the Terrible didn't have access to nuclear weapons or were in charge during a climate crisis. So hurrah for that. So thank God that some really awful people are already dead and will never be able to endanger our species. And that brings me to the second reason to be really hopeful and cheer up right now. I mean, there are still some very wonderful people left doing their utmost best to make things better. I mean, think about, well, Toby Ord, think about us, but think about Kate Raworth, or think about Meghan Markle, or think about Greta Thunberg, or think about somebody you probably don't know, but you actually should because he's really awesome. My 13-year-old nephew, Samuel. And he has his own funny ideas how we could save humankind. And he thinks it would be really great for the future of humankind if we all simultaneously started to believe right now in the concept of reincarnation. Not because he believes in reincarnation, but if we all pretend it exists, we will leave the planet better when we die than if we don't believe in an afterlife. It's simply pure egoism about passing on the future place you're going to inhabit in your next incarnation. So he insists that if we start believing in this life, there won't be only, if we start believing in a life after this life, there won't be only death after this life, but also life after this life. So that will be awesome. And the third and final grain of hope I'd like to share with you is that we all have this amazing tool to help things turn out for the best. And that is, of course, language. Language is a time machine, a telescope for the future. It allows speculating, planning, and the passing of knowledge. And of course, language isn't always safe. It can also enable fake news, cheating, terrible poetry, but it can be, if we use it properly, also be a courier of technology, ethics, and knowledge. I mean, we heal people literally through language. We have built bridges and vaccines thanks to the existence of words. And language doesn't mean everything is going to be okay instantly. I mean, you can still do terrible things with words, as Donald Trump demonstrated extensively with his Twitter account. But just think about how far we humans have come since our first conversation. Language is a vessel so ideas can live long after the fact, after the people who came up disappeared. A good part of the facilities in this room, like the electricity, the lights, your clothes, the glasses in your glasses, even the antidepressants in your blood, were invented by people who are already dead, but we still profit from their ideas. So hurrah for language. It can be a weapon of mass destruction, but we can still use it as a lifebelt, helping us to stay afloat in these dark, terrible times in order to search for land. Language is, in the end, the oxygen of humanity, and if used properly, it will keep us safe. And it will also be the building block for the next hour, which undoubtedly will be as crippling as it will be wonderful. Thank you for listening, and open your ears for the language of the amazing Toby Ord.
Yeah, we'll definitely use some language at least. And thank you for the optimism. I'm going to kill the optimism right away with another fact from or a finding of Toby Ord's book, namely that he estimates that humanity has a 1 in 6 chance of actually going extinct within the next century.
Yeah, that's pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, it's pretty overwhelming.
And also because it's not external factors, but it's us.
It's us. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. With Toby Ord, which you are now already seeing. Such an impressive CV that I'm just going to read some highlights out of it. He's a moral philosopher focusing on the big picture, the future of humanity mainly. He's a senior research fellow at Oxford University's Future of Humanities Institute. He obviously wrote the book The Precipice, and he is the founder of the movement around effective altruism, which is a way to provide help to other people on the basis of rational ideas and data. So welcome, Toby. What did you think language as a lifeboat? Do you agree?
Yeah, I really liked it.
You came in pretty hard in the audience now.
I really like these ideas. I think that this idea of how humans over the last 200,000 years that we've been around have built up language. And I think that this is we tend to think that technologies and advances have all happened very recently. That's because it's only since written language, about 5,000 years ago, that we've been able to kind of show precisely when things happened. But before that, over the 200,000 years earlier, we must have moved from maybe a handful of nouns, pointing at things and names for them, to this kind of rich complexity of language with all the different parts of speech and all the different ways we can express complex thoughts and ideas. Instead of just them being stuck in your head forever, you could share them with other people and we could build on them and pass them down. Yeah. So I think that, it's a very rich part of our inheritance that we have.
But if we wouldn't have language from today on, wouldn't that also solve our problems? If we couldn't speak, couldn't write, couldn't do anything anymore, well, then it's very difficult to make a nuclear bomb.
Well, that's true. And people have said, similarly, that maybe we should relinquish all of our technologies and that would in some way solve the anthropogenic risks, the risks of our own making. And that's true, although it would leave us at the mercy of the natural risks. Yeah. So our days would still be numbered ultimately, but to quite a long period of time. But I think that perhaps humanity's potential is much longer than that. I think that if we play our cards right, we could outlive many of the typical species around us and have a rich life, perhaps until the Earth ceases to be habitable in about 500 million years' time, or perhaps beyond that if we travel further than here. Yeah. It could be that this is the very earliest infancy of humanity if we play our cards right.
We'll go into that a lot further. We'll delve into sort of the menu of existential risks that you lay out in the book and the reasons for optimism, of course. But one of the passages in your book that resonated most strongly with me was about fatherhood. I'm a young father myself, and you describe in your book how the experience of fatherhood made your outlook on these topics quite different, right?
Yeah. Ultimately, just after I had my daughter, I was, I'm sure many people in the audience have been through this themselves. I was suddenly realizing how much one does for another human when you have to do everything for them, when they can't do things for themselves and they're entirely dependent upon you, and how much work that is. It's work that's done with love, but it's still work. And I suddenly thought back to myself as a baby and to my parents, and I realized everything that they'd done for me. And obviously, as a kid, you take your parents for granted. But it's interesting when you have a moment where it suddenly all hits you at once as to how many thousands of hours they spent trying to get my life on track and to look after me. And I was shocked by this enormity of this debt to them that I hadn't really thought about. And
what happened? What happened when you came over to their place and started to talk about them?
Yeah, so when I next got a chance to see them, when they came over from Australia to visit and see my daughter, I told them this a little bit sheepishly, and they just said, that's not how it works. You don't repay your parents. Ultimately, you pass it down. You're doing this for your daughter as we did it for you. And then this struck me that this was a really important aspect when it comes to humanity itself, because the way that the generations work, there have been about 10,000 generations of humans before us. And they've ultimately built things up over that time. They've made small innovations of their own and passed this legacy down to their children. And just as we heard beforehand of all the inventions and ideas that have been created and how they live on after the people who come up with them have died, that there's this inherent chronology of history where the generations can do things to help or hinder the generation that comes after them. But it's very hard to do things backwards in time. So because we have this procession of generations, one after the other, we can't quite have the normal kind of reciprocity that we have between people where they help you and you help them back. Yeah. But instead, we can have this idea of helping those who come after us as we are thankful to those who came before us.
So the arrow of time makes sure that it's more about handing it through to next generations than it is about thanking previous generations, you think?
Indeed, or at least that's one way to kind of pay one's respects.
Yeah. Being a good ancestor is really what it revolves around then, right? And what you lay out in the book is that we are actually in a special moment in history, a unique moment in history. And that's why you base your title of the book on, The Precipice, which means the edge of a cliff. Not a very uplifting title, but why do you think we are actually now on a be it a precipice or a crossroads, a pivotal time in human history?
Yeah, so I have this idea of humanity and the journey of humanity over these hundreds of thousands of years as something like a long journey through the wilderness with times of hardship, but then also times of sudden progress and heady views opening out before us. And it feels like recently, with the kind of ascent through the Industrial Revolution and the scientific revolution and this forms of progress that we've had, we've reached this saddle between the mountains where we've come through and we can see kind of distant lands ahead of us, and we can see places that we might be able to get to where we have riches that are beyond the comprehension of those who came before us, even just a few generations earlier. But just as we've reached this point, our power has grown so rapidly that we've reached this point where we've put ourselves at risk, and where the path ahead is something like a narrow, crumbling path on the cliffside with a steep fall beneath us, this precipice, and that if we put a foot wrong, then that might be the end of this vast journey before we make it to a place that we've been looking for. And we don't know exactly how high this risk is. As you said, my best guess is about 1 in 6, but that is only a best guess.
So a 1 in 6 chance we fall off that cliff edge, you think?
Yeah, and we don't know exactly how high the chance is. I mean, imagine you came to such a path on a journey and you really needed to get back and you were stranded and this was the only way forward, and you don't know how to put an exact number on it, but you know it's the most dangerous situation that you've ever been in.
And how do you define that cliff edge? What is an existential threat, and what makes it different from a random bad day?
Yeah. So what's central about it is that it's a kind of threat that would be the end of our story ultimately. where we have this vast potential at the moment. But there are some things, most obviously a threat of human extinction, which would be the end of our story, because there's no chance for any actions to redeem ourselves after that. There's a kind of irreversibility of the greatest kind. But there might also be things which are short of extinction, but something like a permanent and unrecoverable collapse of civilization. I think that that's quite difficult to have happen, as is extinction. That's the good news. Well, part of the good news of this is that humanity is, I think, very robust and very resilient, and it would take a lot to keep us down in a way from which we can never recover. But I do think that there are some threats that could rise to that level.
But in your book, you also sketch history, and what stands out is that technical solutions that we came up with, came up ever more rapidly. So, can we just rely on a tech fix? You know, if you go back to what time it took to have agriculture or something like that, and now the speed in which we come up with new technologies, can we just lay back and say, well,
technology is going to save us anyway, because that's
even for us against ourselves?
So yeah, I feel kind of in two different directions on this. I think that we can't rely on this, but that doesn't mean that it won't save us. I think that sometimes it has saved us, and sometimes in the future it will. But that's not really a great plan. If you plan on living a long life, to just have some things that have stepped in and saved you in the past, and just hope that they will in the future again. Ultimately, humanity's story has been one of rapidly increasing and accumulating power over the world around us. 200,000 years ago, we were an unexceptional species, just small groups of hunter-gatherers on the African savanna. But what was really set us apart is this ability to learn and to accumulate knowledge over generations, to work together within time and then across time between the generations as well.
Using language among other tools, of course.
Yeah, and so we slowly learned how to make tools, but even a crude, iron shovel would be forever beyond our reach if each generation we had to learn everything anew. The reason that we have all of this prosperity in our generation, as well as great challenges, is because in both cases, they're the inheritance we have from the 100 billion humans who came before us. So, this is where we've come from, and.
But there are also quite some reasons not to be so thankful about our inheritance, right? I mean,
no, we also inherited very bad habits, right? Like being very egocentric. All these habits we have that require 5 Earths to live, to have, and we only have one. So our inheritance is also very negative. It brought us to a point where we are now, that we have to do something that no other generation ever had to do, namely change our ways before the apocalypse. So in the past, when a threat was near, then we changed, but never out of reflection. And now we have to change out of reflection, which is...
Because the severity of the crisis at hand is so big that we might not live through it. So it requires a different motivation to change than previous generations had, I guess.
That's right, and this is extremely difficult. So you're right. We're kind of like someone who's inherited wealth and been educated by their parents and put in a very good position, but is also from a family that's living beyond its means and has inherited these kinds of habits that are not sustainable and needs to change these ways as well. And you're right that humanity, by and large, is quite good at learning from trial and error. If the errors are survivable, even if they're quite great, then something can be, perhaps even at the largest level we've had historically, a dark age that is still recoverable, and also where we learn some important lessons from it. Yeah. But there are these existential risks, and it's most clear with extinction that's something that you can't learn from. And so, can humanity survive through many centuries to come? We've had 2,000 centuries in the past. Can we survive another 2,000 centuries without ever once falling victim to one of these risks? That's the great challenge, that it requires a very different way of thinking. Exactly. And it requires this advanced planning that you mentioned.
Yeah. Do you think we are capable of that? Did we ever do something similar on this scale?
No, I don't think we have done something similar on the scale. But I do think that we're capable of it. And I think that this is something that actually ties in with what you said right at the start about free will. And in particular, I like this thought about free will for humanity as opposed to for a human.
Yeah. So resuming, what is at stake? What does this precipice mean? Where are we right now? And how big is the task at hand?
Yeah, so the task at hand is very big. I think that we were subject to, maybe a couple of % chance that we didn't make it through the 20th century, and then substantially greater, maybe 10 times as much risk in this century.
This is a number that I noticed that it almost makes me laugh rather than be worried, because it's such a precise number and it's so large that it's hard to fathom really the impact of what you're saying. Do you encounter that a lot, that people might be laughing it away a little bit?
Maybe. That's a common, this very human reaction. It's not meant to be precise. I tried to be as kind of unprecise as I can be. You could think of it as somewhere between, say, 1 in 10 and 1 in 20. So not 1 in 10 and 1 in 20, between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 or something like that. Say 10 to 20%, so something in that area.
Right.
And I wanted to make clear what my own estimates were, just in order to avoid confusion where you say something is a very grave possibility, but what you mean is that there's a 1 in 1,000 chance, but then the person listening interprets that as a 50% chance or something like that.
Yeah.
So to try to just be clear what ballpark I'm talking. But also, if you look at it the other way around, a 1 in 6 chance that we don't make it through the century is the same as saying a 5 in 6 chance that we do. So I expect that we will survive the century.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like that, though.
In the book.
In the book, it doesn't feel like that. But maybe run us through the menu of what's ahead, and the menu that you lay out in the book and in your work about the existential threats. Maybe give us a top 3 of things that we really should worry about.
Okay, well, so I'll do that. I'll do it in a kind of more chronological order. So there are natural risks that we've always been subject to, most famous of which is probably the risk of asteroid impacts. And there's others, such as the risk of supervolcanic eruptions that could darken the skies globally and cause global cooling in the same way that an asteroid...
Sorry, the sound is a bit soft now.
One
Maybe
moment,
we can
Toby.
pull it up a bit again, because
Okay.
it's hard to
Nothing's
understand
changed in
you.
my...
You were telling us about supervolcanoes mainly,
Yeah,
the natural risks.
There are supervolcanic eruptions is another possibility. There are comets that could hit us. So that there's a handful of these natural risks. But luckily with the natural risks, we have some idea of how likely they are, because they're something where we can look at the fossil record and see how often they've happened before to other species. And we know that they're not very likely.
Yeah.
And we even know that for natural risks we haven't even discovered yet, that they can't be that likely, because humanity and other mammals have survived for hundreds of thousands of years. And if the risks was too high, then there's just no chance we would have survived that long.
Yeah.
So that's the good news about the natural risks, is that I would put them at less than a 1 in 10,000 chance per century, that we should be able to survive something like 1 million years from natural risks.
Yeah.
Then
so the natural
we
risks are huge, and they're natural. They're supervolcanoes. They're meteorites.
And when
Yeah,
they
I think
hit,
the
it's a big
supervolcanoes are
problem,
the big-
but they're not so likely.
They're not so likely, indeed.
Yeah.
Although if there were no anthropogenic risks, I would suggest that we devote quite a lot of time to the natural ones. I think they're large enough that they're worth serious attention.
Yeah.
But as it turns out, I think that they're substantially smaller than the ones that we've made ourselves.
Yeah.
And that began in 1945 with the development of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And that's the moment that I date this beginning of what I call the precipice, this time period that I think will last somewhere between 1 and a few centuries.
And why that
very
date?
high risk.
Why the invention of nuclear weapons and not the start of the Industrial Revolution or a point like that?
It's a good question. So I think that if you look at the Industrial Revolution, that was the start of these emissions. But because these started quite slowly, and more than half of the emissions that humanity has released happened after 1980, that ultimately there wasn't enough emissions released by 1945 to pose this serious threat. But climate change is different to many of these others in that these other risks in that it's so gradual, as opposed to something like a nuclear war that could be very sharp and sudden.
Yeah, climate change is not on the menu of completely existential risk. It's a risk in your view, but it wouldn't wipe humanity out. There's no plausible scenario in which it would.
No, I think that there is plausible scenarios, potentially. Climate change is obviously very bad for everyday reasons that everyone understands. It's already... and these are going to get worse. And they're going to get worse even if we do something about it, but they could get a lot worse.
Yeah, because it's very significant that you don't see climate change as the most existential threat for this moment. And in all the media, this is the thing we talk about.
Yeah, so I guess I would say, we've left the natural risks behind. We've come to climate and nuclear war. And these are the first two big anthropogenic risks. And my best guess estimate for them is that the chance that kind of we meet our end over the next 100 years due to either nuclear war or climate is about 1 in 1,000 in each case. So it's very clear how they could cause global devastation and maybe a temporary collapse of civilization at some level.
Yeah, but it wouldn't push us over the edge. So
yeah, and just to be
very
clear,
difficult to see how it could.
And just to be clear, we are talking about risk that it could exterminate us in the next 100 years. So climate change is a severe threat, only it won't kill us in this century.
Won't kill us now, maybe later.
Yeah, and you are talking about stuff that can kill us in this century, and that's what we're talking about today.
So that's right. Although actually I think that it's unlikely that climate change would kill us in a subsequent century as well. But I don't think it's impossible. And in fact, I think that the chance of it is much higher than the chance that we get destroyed by an asteroid or any of the natural risks. So I think that it's many times higher. And it is also, we're talking, this week about the COP conference, COP26, and should we make great efforts to keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, or the other target of 2 degrees.
No, to be clear, it's not that you are arguing that climate change is not a risk, but it's not on the top of the list of main threats, and that's
for this century.
For this century, but it's an interesting remark because so much attention now goes to climate change, and so little attention goes to the things that we're going to run you by just now. The top 3 of existential threats that you see coming that we should really get more prepared for.
That's right, although I'm not sure if it's the right emphasis. That's kind of like saying people are focused on the 4th most important thing in the world. And, that's great. I think that climate change is vastly important and deserves a huge amount of attention. And I think that it would deserve a huge amount of attention, even if it didn't pose an existential risk directly. And that also that the amount of existential risk that it poses, while smaller than some other things that are forthcoming with future technologies, is still substantial and may actually be the worst thing about climate change. Yeah. But it isn't. Sometimes one hears that it's already kind of a foregone conclusion that humanity will be wiped out by climate change. That's not what the science says. There's actually very few papers that really bear on the question of whether humanity could be destroyed by climate change, and they tend to think that it could not be. And it's quite hard to see what a mechanism could be which could make that happen. Yeah. That's not to belittle climate change at all.
What other anthropogenic risks? That's how you call them, the risks that we cause ourselves. What do you see coming in the next 100 years that we should really watch out for?
Yeah, so then there's these risks that are kind of still on the horizon, where there are technologies that we're developing, but are perhaps not quite at the level where they pose these risks yet. And the 2 of those that I'm most concerned about are the risks from engineered pandemics. And we've had a big taste of what pandemics can do recently, but it could be much worse than that. So, for example, the Black Death, which was a natural pandemic, it killed about a third of the people in Europe.
A third of the people in Europe were dead. Yeah.
That's right. Over a few years.
And we have the capability now to engineer such a pandemic.
Yeah. And we do. And it killed about a third of the people in Europe, and it couldn't spread across the world because people from Europe hadn't yet reached the Americas or Australia. But even then, it probably killed about 1 in 10 people in the entire world.
And why didn't it happen already? Why didn't any country put this forward?
There are some people that say we are living through an engineered pandemic right now, right? So,
I don't think that this is an engineered pandemic.
No.
But that shows you a taste of how large the natural events can be. That was just about 7 centuries ago. And 1 century ago, we had the 1918 flu. And we don't know exactly how many people that killed, but it was global in extent. It got everywhere in the world, including to far-flung islands. And that killed more than 1% of the people in the world. So ultimately, COVID is not an outlier in terms of its of how bad it is. We've had things that are substantially worse, and we could again. And particularly if people make bioweapons, either terrorist groups or nation states, using advanced techniques that we have now and the ones that will develop over the coming decades, then there's concern that it might not just wipe out 10% of people, but it might actually destroy us altogether.
Are there any concrete signs that this is already happening? I know that in Rotterdam there's a virologist, Ron Fouché, who engineered, I think, a bird flu virus a while ago that would kill around 70% of people coming into contact with that. Cheerful number as well. Are there more projects like that running in the world that we should really watch out for?
I'm not sure of any quite as bad as that at the moment, but that one was salutary. That was a case of this bird flu that was extremely deadly, but was not transmissible between mammals. It was only transmissible from birds to mammals, and birds to birds, of course. And this was an attempt at something called gain-of-function research, which I think is
gain-of-function research, yeah.
Yeah, where it makes it was a well-meaning scientist who was trying to make a pathogen more deadly, or in this case, more transmissible. So if they try to make them worse, either more deadly or more transmissible, that's gain-of-function research. And it poses this risk that there was, I think, a risk posed there that if this new version that had been made transmissible between mammals, as it was, were to get out of the lab, then, it could have easily killed millions of people or more.
Yeah, so a bioengineered pandemic is top of your list of existential threats right now.
It's second on my list.
Yeah.
Second.
Do you think there's enough attention and enough safeguards in place to prevent this from actually?
No.
But why didn't it happen then? Sometimes I think if there's one lunatic, very smart, and because a nuclear bomb is very difficult to make, but a virus can be made in a lab. It's less complicated maybe if you're smart. So why didn't it happen already?
Well, so you're exactly right, and that's the argument that concerns me as well. Is that the democratization of biotechnology, the fact that it's spreading so quickly, is what's most scary about it.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you take something like CRISPR, this technology for gene editing, or you take gene drives, a technology for spreading the things in the wild, these were both developed, in the last decade. Yeah. CRISPR's, there's been Nobel Prizes awarded for the development of this.
Yeah, CRISPR is a technology technology with which you can simply cut and paste genetic information into other people's DNA and viruses' DNA.
And you can make strawberries blue, or you can just CRISPR nice crops or nice babies, maybe.
Or a nice virus.
Yeah.
Indeed. And so this technology, it was just 2 years in both cases between being invented by some of the brightest scientists in the world working in the most well-equipped labs to the time when students in science competitions were using these techniques. 2 years. And then all of a sudden, the pool of people who have access to it is much larger. That's in some ways the best thing about biotech, but it's also the worst thing when it comes to this shadow side of the risks. So those types of risks are increasing, and more people are getting access to these things. It's still not the case that most people have access, or that a high school science student could do this. But eventually, we are going to run into someone who has very bad intentions,
Yeah.
and they're going to make
Yeah,
something.
and I did ask you about the safeguards. Are there any that can actually prevent a virus like that from escaping or being deployed by people with bad intentions?
Yeah, it's difficult. There have been a whole lot of lab escapes from well-meaning labs. Even the very highest level of biosecurity, BSL-4, there's a known lab escape from BSL-4 in the UK, in Pirbright, that was foot and mouth disease and caused an outbreak of that here. And there have been a number of escapes. The most recent people to suffer from SARS, SARS-1, were from lab escapes in Beijing, and the most recent, the final deaths from smallpox were in Britain with a lab escape. So it definitely happens, even for the very most concerning pathogens. And that's from escaping from labs. There's also cases of bioweapons programs that had let things escape. The Soviet bioweapons, they were using smallpox, and that escaped. They also accidentally sprayed anthrax out over a city next to where the biolab.
The short answer would be no. We don't have enough safeguards yet to prevent this, right?
That's right. I mean, the people are trying hard with the safeguards, but they probably, at the very least, should put some of these most secure facilities on islands or in very out-of-the-way places. There are more things that can be done, and the fact that the very most secure places are still leaking is bad. And there's other issues, such as this bird flu experiment you mentioned wasn't even done at the highest level of biosafety for the rather farcical reason that that bird flu wasn't human-to-human transmissible and thus didn't qualify as the type of pathogen that needs the highest level, even though the whole point of the experiment was to make it so that it was transmissible in this way.
Yeah.
Maybe the last one in your top 3, and then go to more.
We had one, right? We had the bioengineered
and nuclear
pandemic,
nuclear
the
weapons.
Nuclear war was a big issue, and then number 3.
I would say AI.
AI.
Yeah.
Why?
So the risk in particular that there are a lot of AI systems that are deployed at the moment that do things like change what an image looks like to make it look better or something like that. That's not any kind of existential threat.
Could we put up the volume again a little bit, because I have trouble understanding you a little bit.
Yeah.
You were talking about artificial intelligence and
Yes.
how it's used for recognizing pictures now.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really seem like an existential threat just yet.
That's right. There are many narrow purposes for artificial intelligence at the moment that are driving the current proliferation of AI into everything. And that's great. I don't have any problem with that. The original goal of the scientists working on artificial intelligence was to create generally intelligent systems, a system that's intelligent in the way that a human is, where it can learn to do all of these different things, the one and the same system, and where a system could have goals in the world and set out to go and achieve those goals using its general intelligence to build tools and of its own devising, and kind of open-ended exploration of things.
Yeah, maybe to explain this risk more concretely, it's nice to quote your fellow worker at the Institute for the Future of Humanity, Nick Bostrom, right? His example of the paperclip producing AI. Could you explain that example? And is that a good example of how it could run amok?
Yeah. So this is an example. If you use one of these ideas for creating a more generally intelligent system, and you give it a goal in the world, where it knows about the world, it understands the world, and it's trying to make something happen, which is not the case with the current systems. They're just trying to make an image better. They don't have any idea that there are real humans who look at images or anything like that. But if you were to make a system that was generally intelligent, you gave it some kind of goal, and the paperclip, in making more paperclips is just meant to be a stand-in goal for the type of thing that a company who's deploying it, they might be an office stationery company or something, and they want to make more paperclips. And you could just replace that with anything.
Yeah, and the computer just wants to make more paper clips and then does anything in its path to create more paper clips, ever more paper clips until everything is dead and we're all gone, right? That's the analogy of the story. So
that's the analogy of the story. And that if you think about it, even if the computer could realize that we actually don't just want paper clips to the exclusion of all else, if it's programmed to try to maximize the number of paper clips, what it will notice is that at some point the humans will want to shut it down. And then it wouldn't be able to create as many paper clips. So it would come up with this instrumental goal in order to avoid being shut down. And things would follow from this. That's the idea.
But in this story, what strikes me is that it's not the intelligence that is threatening, but it's the autonomy. So it's even if it's a really dumb machine or intelligence, even if it's really dumb, the moment it's autonomous, then it gets dangerous. Is that also for you the most threatening about AI?
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure where I draw the line between the autonomy and the intelligence, but you're right that it's a combination of both.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be paperclips. A more realistic example, maybe what Nick should have said is it's set to maximize profit for the company. And then people would say, oh, now I see why someone would do that, whereas I don't see why they would do the paperclip thing.
Yeah.
But then it would be incentivized to cheat and steal and kill to make profit, so long as the cheating, stealing, killing hadn't been explicitly coded in as things it can't do, which are quite hard to encode.
Basically, you could say that we are living in a day and age in which the economy is run by that algorithm, is profit or growth almost at any cost, right? So we're maybe seeing autonomous systems or systems in which some kind of collective intelligence is already pursuing this behavior. So it's not so far-fetched.
I think that's a fruitful analogy, actually, that one can see an analogy between corporations, which are in some sense super intelligent because they're made of a whole lot of humans and they're in some ways able to do tasks that no individual human can do.
Yeah.
And also that their goal structures, in some cases, are being set by maximizing a very narrow objective instead of the kind of more rich goal structures that humans have and sets of constraints.
Yeah, exactly. So the AI misses the worldview we have, in which it's very logical that some things will never be worth going after because, of course, it's more important to have, I don't know, nature instead of a paperclip. And the AI doesn't have that
moral
reasoning in itself, so it will never account for that.
That's right. There's the diversity of objectives that we have. There's the moral reasoning that we have, where even if we really desire something and it's part of what we want, we're aware that this could break certain rules and it could get in the way of what other people want. And so that limits what we do. And then also our empathy, just the fact that even if you have a human who kind of thinks that they don't believe in morality and they're just out to maximize whatever is good in their life, they'll still balk at hurting other people, which is a great feature of the human brain.
But in bioweapons and nuclear bombs, I can see the threat. You know, that's really it's right there.
It's
but with AI, how does it threaten us in this century?
So I'll give you a little sketch of the type of thing that could happen that could be helpful. So suppose that researchers develop a system that has this artificial general intelligence. And the system, at the moment, all of the computing systems involve computation that's outside of the office, that's on remote server farms and things like this, where the computers are based. So there's already the kind of internet possibilities kind of intrinsically built into these things. It's very hard to just have one in the lab running on a computer that's not connected to anything. So what if one of these computers that understood, and also at the moment, if you look at something called GPT-3, that's a computing language system that is trained on basically a scrape of all of the text on the internet. So these systems have seen everything that there is. They know everything that's written down on the internet, instructing people how to hack computers, among other things. And if it could then get onto the internet and spread in the same way, maybe it will have seen examples of a whole lot of viruses and how they work. If it could use some of these techniques in order to put itself onto, let's say, 1 million randomly chosen computer hard drives where it lies dormant in case the original copy gets stopped. At that point, it's kind of almost too late to stop such a system. It could have millions of copies of itself, and the largest botnets that have been created by non-super intelligent criminal gangs of actual humans are bigger than this. So there's proof of concept that this could happen. Then how would we ever get rid of it, short of ultimately destroying every computer that we have? And how would you ever coordinate everyone to do that?
There's no off button. There's no way to pull the plug or push a red button to stop it.
Exactly. And this is a fact that, as well as perhaps being more intelligent than a human, it has these other abilities, such as the ability to copy itself digitally, such that if that can make it much harder to stop than a human who's gone off the
But
rails.
this is, I think, for many people also quite a familiar scenario, right? This is where what sci-fi movies are made of, good books. Please tell us we're better prepared for this risk than for the other ones.
No, unfortunately. So there's relatively little being done on this. Very little is being spent on safety of these systems compared to what's being spent on the capabilities. So the capabilities, I mean, like with humanity itself, where our power is running away, exponentially growing, but our wisdom is only growing falteringly, if at all. There's a similar story when it comes to AI, where its power is growing, very quickly year by year. But our ability to control it or to make sure that its goals are aligned with our goals, so that when it optimizes for something, that actually creates things that we really want in the world.
Yeah.
This is not going very well.
No,
Okay.
you have to only look at Mark Zuckerberg to see that one's values are not aligned with another one's values.
But I
sometimes,
want to
right?
hear the good news, because this sounds very depressing and also overwhelming. Like, where should we start to do something about these threats?
Yeah, and that's where your optimism kicks in, I hope, Toby, because you talked us down, you talked the audience down. Now, please lift us up again.
So, you talked earlier about this kind of question of free will for humanity, and I think that's a great question. That we can think of ethics from an individual perspective about what should I do, and we can also think of it from a group, like community perspective, or maybe even from a national perspective, and then more recently from a global perspective. What should everyone alive today do? And I suggest that we need to think more often about ethics from the perspective of humanity. What should humanity do if it's trying to survive and live over deep time, where we take seriously the 10,000 generations that came before us and the tens of thousands of generations that could come after us? And we think, what should our generation, what part should we play in this? And that helps us realize that we're being so impatient in thinking about the future. And then what part in that should I play? So to kind of occasionally step up to this even larger level, where it's harder when the more people you include together in a group, the less coherent it is, and the harder it is to think about these things sometimes, and sometimes the less useful it is to take this.
But there seems to be a paradox there in your reasoning, because you say that we should come together as humanity, and not only as humanity, but also transcend the boundaries of generations. We should visualize ourselves as part of this huge cone of generations, the 10,000 that became before us. We're in the middle on the precipice, and then there's a whole range of generations to come, 10,000s maybe. Doesn't that paralyze more than activate?
I don't think so. I think that it can mean that we see what's at stake. We see how important things are, and that we need to be able to take some kinds of sacrifices. So as an example, it's very difficult to say precisely how much humanity is spending on avoiding existential risk, but we can safely say it's less than we're spending on ice cream.
Wow.
That's a calculation. So this is not a case of a species that's got its act together and is taking this stuff appropriately seriously. But the good news is...
Well, wait, maybe we should pause a little bit to let this sink in. Humanity is spending more on ice cream than on preventing existential risks.
But that's also depressing. That's also
also depressing. It's only depressing.
Because it doesn't give much faith in where our priorities lie, right? If that gets all our attention and our existential threats not.
I think it's because we haven't really woken up to this issue, and that we certainly have the potential to spend a lot more and to care about this much more, and that it's something where, while for an individual human, your future might not be within your control. Individual lives get buffeted around by forces beyond our control that are bigger than us, like an outbreak of war or a pandemic or something like this. But for humanity itself, our future is ultimately within our control. It's not that the chance that an asteroid comes, before we develop deflection technologies in the next 20 years or something is extremely small. Things like that are very unlikely to knock us off course. If we're knocked off course, it's going to be probably due to some mistake of our own making. And that's on us. Ultimately, we collectively have the power, I think, to fulfill the enormous potential that we have.
Where do you base that confidence on? Why do you think we as humanity are capable of that?
Well, there are courses of action that a bunch of humans could do where we get through this. And take it as an example. the Secretary General of the United Nations has just released this report, which is kind of setting forward what he wants to do in the next 5 years of his term, called Our Common Agenda. And it's trying to get the idea of caring about future generations to be a core idea of the United Nations and what the United Nations is about. It's trying to get the General Assembly to make a declaration on the future where it takes responsibilities for future generations in the same way that it took on human rights as a core responsibility. And then it's also trying to get protection against existential risks as something that the UN sees as part of its mission. So
your work is now on the agenda at the United Nations level, but still, I mean, apart from these directions for solutions, they sound great, and it sounds like something humanity could aspire to, but it also seems pretty far away from how things are being run today. How would you propose, give us a shopping list, what to do tomorrow to start mitigating these existential risks?
Okay, so when it comes to the bio risks that we were talking about, there is a really good technology on the horizon, which is called metagenomic sequencing. And what that's about is a system that can just take a sample of blood from a human, and it sequences all the DNA and RNA in that sample. And what that can do is do surveillance for diseases, such that you could work out very quickly, such as when the pandemic was just beginning in China in 2019, to have immediately worked out that it was a novel pathogen that was making people sick, that the most similar thing was SARS. And that would have sped up things much faster, and the outbreak could well have been controlled. And that type of technology helps defense much more than it helps offense.
So still
accelerating
a
that technology.
Yeah,
it's a technology fix.
It's not a fix where we have to change. It's something external.
Yeah, I think there's a mix of both. I mean, so this is a technological fix that I think would be very useful.
Yeah.
Also, governments often were caught off guard by the pandemic. And I know that the situation in the UK, we have a register of big risks. But when we're not properly prioritizing the risks that are low probability but extremely high stakes, they weren't kind of properly managed on the risk register. So I'm trying to encourage the UK government to do that right going forward. Yeah, so that's an example of government taking these things more seriously.
Basically try to get a wholesome view of what's actually threatening us, and to put that at center stage in government agendas. But the solutions that you lay out, surveillance of disease, maybe you can explain some of your other solutions as well, but they all seem to point in the direction of a world government, a situation of more control. Whereas maybe we're seeing now in the pandemic that this might work on paper, but not in practice. And this also leads to a lot of polarization, even to such extent that it might become more difficult to bring humanity together behind solutions.
Yeah, I'm not in favor of a world government approach to this. I am in favor of humanity having better coordination and cooperation between nations through treaties and agreements that we come to. So, for example, if the member states of the UN were to support this Our Common Agenda set of ideas, then I think that would really help kind of cement kind of care for future generations into things that the member states have signed up to. Yeah. But a world government itself, if it was more like one big country, then I worry that would actually create its own raft of existential risks to do with things like global totalitarianism and the like, and make those things more possible. So I wouldn't go that far.
And being cooperative then is essential, because otherwise you need or a totalitarian regime, or it just won't work. So then it depends on us. Yeah,
and I think that at the moment when it comes to, say, climate change, the world has made great steps in terms of decarbonization. If you look at the charts, the New York Times recently had a great one, and Our World in Data has great stuff on this. The UK, where I'm currently based, has halved or almost halved the per person carbon emissions. It peaked in the 1970s, and over the last 50 years, it's been coming down. But the other country where I was born, Australia, it's still going up, and it's at its highest it's ever been. So some countries have done quite a lot on this, while other countries have done much less. And that shows that that there is it's not that we all go do the same thing automatically. There are choices that the public are making and how much they care about and how much they push their governments on. So ultimately, the idea of environmentalism is quite recent, really kind of rose to prominence in the 1960s. And yet, in the end of its first decade of rising to prominence, there were ministers for the environment in almost every English-speaking country and many other countries around the world.
So we have come together on pressing issues, and that is in itself a source for hope, you say.
And how much time do we have? In how much time do we need to fix this before these threats will,
Well, there's no sharp answer to that. I mean, as I said, if I said 1 in 6 chance this century. I also say that with a business as usual, if we just didn't care about these things, it would be more like a 1 in 3 chance is my best guess.
Wow.
But if we really got our act together, it would be very close to 0% chance.
Okay.
So the 1 in 6 is assuming there's a decent chance we get our act together, but not an overwhelming chance. But I think that shows that I'm saying that the best kind of attempts that humanity could make on this would lower this by a lot.
Okay.
So I think there's so much that we could do about it. It's all within our power.
We're now sort of moving out of a crisis situation. It wasn't an existential threat, but it was a sort of a dry run or a fire drill for the big one, you would say. You could say. How do you think we did? How do you think the pandemic did it show readiness or complete unpreparedness for the big stuff?
Yeah, I don't think we did terribly well with the pandemic. I think that science probably outperformed what we were expecting with the vaccine development. And these new RNA vaccines were a very big step forward. It was a kind of coming of age for them, and they'll be a useful thing in our arsenal. But one of the things that I'd thought when I was writing The Precipice, which is written before COVID, was that if there was a clear and present danger, where if there was a really big threat that was coming right at us and everyone agreed that it was there, then we'd really get our act together. And that doesn't seem to have borne fruit. It seems that actually nations were quite bad individually and even worse at collaborating with other nations when there was a clear external danger. So that was quite disappointing. The silver lining is that it has woken us up and reminded us that despite all of our progress against infectious disease, that we're not invulnerable.
Right,
and
so we did poorly, but at least it primed us into thinking more about these types of risk. I'm not sure if that makes me more optimistic or more apocalyptic.
Me neither. I think maybe people here want to ask questions now. Questions from the
are there
audience.
questions for Toby? We
I
have
see
two lovely assistants running around here.
I see one there.
Is it on?
I have a question. These risks that you were talking about were actually in isolation of each other. And isn't there a bigger threat that these risks combined can be of a bigger risk? For instance, AI can be used, of course, say for
to supercharge a pandemic.
Nuclear war, for instance. When this submarine captain in Russia back in 1962 made his decision whether to fire his missile or not, he was dependent on information. And now we are in a world with lots of disinformation, algorithms being used, AI being used, not overseeing what AI might do in the future. So one has the illusion that you are in control.
Yeah,
rather
and
we
you
are
say,
not in control.
And what you say is that we have an illusion that these risks are separate. So I think that's the main question for you, Toby. What happens if these risks come together and, they supercharge each other?
Yeah, I'm quite worried about this.
That's a surprise.
The good news on the risks coming together is that for some of them, say the risk that an asteroid combines with the risk of a supervolcano or something like that, that's very unlikely because each one is so unlikely that the chance you get them both at the same time is vanishingly unlikely. But for the risks that are more likely, then this can be a bigger issue. And climate change, in some ways, is probably going to have most of its impact on existential risk via kind of acting as a stressor, being putting humanity into the situation where we're already both geopolitical tensions are at a height, and also that we feel we're already doing a lot in terms of reorganizing our societies and so on. And we don't feel that we've got much appetite for regulating artificial intelligence, say, and working out, what is the best way to go forward on that.
Well, and not
that's
only,
another way that they combine.
And not only a lack of appetite for regulating it, it's part of a power struggle now. And so in that sense, the question from the audience, AI mixes with geopolitical risk, and they all sort of mix together, which makes it a more difficult situation even, probably, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another question from the audience.
All the way in the top. Hi, yeah, thank you very much. I was wondering, because we've been talking about the future of existence as it is at the moment, the way we're keeping society as it is, as it's developing right now. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the future of humanity, the existence of humanity in societies other than the one we are trying to keep afloat at the moment?
You mean other cultures, or?
Just other ways of society, I guess, or I'm not sure if that's something.
Maybe we need a kind of precipice to change our ways into a better kind of society. Is that behind your question?
Yeah, I guess, because it's all been focused on, okay, society is like this right now, and what is the future of existence of us in this society?
If we have other dreams, if we just have other dreams, then we can also steer into another direction. We don't have to perceive or keep it as it is.
What are your thoughts on this, Toby?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the future is very long. If we look back, even at the period of time where we've had cities and what we call civilization, is about 5,000 years out of 200,000 years. And we should expect that if we can survive at least as long as we've survived so far, another 200,000 years. What would cultures be like over that time? It's almost impossible to guess. I think that we need to have a deep humility about this question about what would be the best way for things to be, or even what is a likely way for society to be. I think that there's a lot of possibility for individuals to have lives which are much better than the lives that we by and large have now. Yeah. And also for ways of organizing society which are much better. I don't have any particular insights on what such ways are. But I think we need to be, very open to the idea that the future could be extremely different to the past, and yet still much better.
In line with the question, what do we need to get rid of in our culture? What do we need to let go? Which values, which habits?
Yeah, I guess I would say a kind of impatience is a key thing to get rid of. This is one of the kinds of things you can gain from thinking occasionally from this perspective of humanity. If we think of a typical mammalian species living 1 million years as an individual human life, I think it puts it into perspective where humanity at 200,000 years in is just like an adolescent. Yeah. And the political cycles that we have of about 5 years is just like 5 hours in your life. And we're so fixated on the next 5 hours, or in some cases, the next few minutes or seconds, with almost no kind of thought that maybe we need to be patient and delay gratification by a few hours or a few days or something.
But at the same time, you're saying that we shouldn't be too patient because we have to act now because we are now at the edge of the precipice, right?
Yeah, you're right. And there's an apparent tension there, but it's not a real tension. The issue is, so suppose you're on a cliff edge and you're having some fun, and you're young and reckless adolescent. Maybe you're doing some rock climbing. And this is something where at one level, it's the risks you're facing are because you're not taking seriously the rest of your life and how long that could be and how short the period that you're currently in is. Yeah. But by the same token, because that period's so dangerous, you need to get yourself off that cliff as quickly and safely as you can. And so there is an urgency that we act on those risks, but that urgency comes from our patience about the fact that the pleasures and values and flourishing we get in our life, there's so much more of that to come.
I think we have room for 2 or 3 more questions. Marije, right there.
Okay. Maybe you touched upon it a little bit just now, but you're talking about quite precise threats. And maybe we know more, there are more threats we don't know yet about. So I know Wouter likes to write about this, that we maybe need a different story as humankind, to maybe how we relate to nature and how we interact with each other, maybe through the cosmos as well. But isn't that maybe a better approach? To not focus on a concrete solution for one threat, but maybe a little bit more dive inside ourselves.
That's something that we talked about before. Maybe Jessica can explain this. This is a very interesting point.
Yeah, we asked before to one of our, to Philip Blom, we asked, is the story we have not the biggest threat we have? And not these precise...
Well, and there seems to be a way of thinking that you propose, that we are still dominating the planet. If we survive the precipice, then we can go into the galaxy and, well, basically stay the same internally. Whereas the very existential threats that you talked about now are maybe a result of a wrong type of attitude towards nature, and maybe we should stop dominating and feeling superior to over nature instead of trying to get rid of the risks so we can continue our way.
Yeah, instead of longing for a great future of humanity.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't think that's the single most important thing we could do on this. I think that maybe, when it comes to environmentalism and the concerns about the environment, that rethinking our role in the environment is the key thing. When it comes to the threats that we're facing from things, say, like nuclear war, it's not clear to me how, it seems like what you want to do is have more treaties to get rid of the missiles and things, rather than that we need to kind of become more in touch with how we think about our position with domination over the world.
No, so maybe not, but like a nuclear bomb, it's also the result of great science. So maybe we should rethink how great science is if that puts us on a threat that is almost not containable. So that's a really rebranding our story or reinventing our story, and maybe make really radical decisions about what we want to spend our money and time on, because it led us here.
I like a lot of this. The way I think about it, though, is that the first step that we have is get ourselves off this precipice. Being aware of where we are and edging our way off, and then once we get off, we can rethink what choices led us to get onto this precipice. But at the moment, I think that rather than take the time to reflect upon what choices got you here or something, just get off is the key. And that's
sorry, I'm a philosopher. I always want to think first, but you're right. We need to act.
So I think we act first to get ourselves to a place of security. Then we need to do a lot of deep reflection before we work out what we ultimately want to be.
You say it's too urgent now. We don't have time to think. We don't have time to adjust. We need to act.
Or at least acting is a central part of what we need.
But at the same time, not be impatient. So I'm still looking for.
Well,
maybe we have room for one more question.
I see questions here.
Bring them on.
I hope so too. Thank you so much for this intervention. I really like the question as well about supercharging, because I do see climate change supercharging things like the Zika virus, like Ebola, these type of things. But really what I wanted to move towards was this idea that you had. You said, okay, well, governments saw this pandemic, were totally unprepared. And that's really interesting for me, because I come from a background working in intelligence and security. And years ago, and I mean 5, 6, 7 years ago, we already had intelligence estimate that said some of the larger existential threats will be pandemics. Yeah. So it's not like the signals weren't there, they were there. And so when I hear you talk about we should be, informing governments, it's not so much about informing them, it's about making sure they start taking it seriously. So I'd love to hear from you what you propose that we as either society or like you and I, myself, scientists, what can we do to get those types of things that are more long-term on the agenda rather than the short-term political game, as you said, the next 5 years, the next 5 minutes, the next 5 hours?
That's a great question. I think it might be the question, right?
Yeah. So I entirely agree that there are plenty of people who called pandemics as a serious threat. In fact, my book says so, and it came out before the pandemic as well. So, but a lot of people said this, and at some level, the governments took it seriously, but not seriously enough, and not in any kind of proportion to the size of the threat. So you're right that getting them to actually take these things seriously is more important, or a bigger part of the key than even seeing the things in advance.
And how would you do
How
it?
do we do that? One of the ways, as people who are experts in the particular risks, taking this to government and trying to work with people there to make sure that it's not just that it appears somewhere in a chart or something, but what are their steps around it? But, what do they see as the main risks? If they see something like in the UK, flooding as one of the main risks they want to talk about because it happens every year, rather than things that happen less often, to say, no, we don't think that's right. We think that these bigger risks are threats to the UK existing in the future. Like flooding is not, it's very different, much smaller. But as public, as for more people, I think that we need to start having these conversations about our role in the universe and how, and what we hope, or our role as a generation as part of humanity, and that we want to be able to pass the baton on and have continued generations, and to ultimately indicate to politicians that we want to vote based on this, and that if they want to be in government in the next term, that's because they're going to be taking these things seriously and showing us what they're doing about it.
So that's what we can do,
That's what we
individuals,
can do.
to put it on the agenda when we vote.
Did you become more apocalyptic or more hopeful
It's like with
after this conversation?
I feel a bit like when you try to answer a philosophical question, you rapidly know, okay, I'm never going to answer it, but still you need to try. And that's what you gave me. We need to try, and you gave out a map where we could start. So I'm not sure if I think, well, we're going to resolve it, but I got motivated to try and think about it more.
Maybe I can see some hands. I'm curious also about the audience. Who's
frightened?
leaving here with an apocalyptic feeling? Who of you are leaving more pessimistic? Okay, that's around a third or something. Or is
You
it
have
more?
to vote.
No,
You cannot not vote, okay? So
it's almost half.
Yeah, so
Toby,
now, just to check.
I assume the other half is leaving more optimistically.
More optimistic?
Yeah, I think there's
okay.
a slight majority for optimism, so I think you did a good job there,
Yes.
Toby. Later today, we're actually going to talk about that bigger story, the overarching change of the narrative in society, with Jeremy Lent in Future Affairs at Brainwash Festival. And for now, we're going to leave it at this, I guess.
Thank you so much
please
for your
give
time. It was
Toby
a
Ord
big
a big
honor.
round of applause.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience as
Yeah.
well. Thank you.
Yeah, also at home. Bye.